By way of introduction, my name is Alli Bunitng, and I'm the manager of programs and operations here at CanWaCH, and my pronouns are she and her. I had the fortunate time this past week to take some time off and to actually be able to go camping and hiking, which was really lovely, and to spend some time in the beautiful Coast Salish territories that I live on out here in BC. And as I was hiking and wandering around in the woods and getting very sweaty, I was also just so incredibly grateful for the historic and the ongoing continued Indigenous leadership that we have here in Canada, and their stewardship of the land, their stewardship of their communities. And I know that we're joined by colleagues from across Turtle Island today, and I just really feel gratitude for our ability to live on these lands, and I recognize my responsibility as an uninvited settler to support and to stand in solidarity with Indigenous leadership that continues to exist across Canada here today. So in terms of the agenda for today, we'll have 3 presentations. So with me, we have Merydth Holte-McKenzie, myself, and then Juanita Gnanapragasam. So they are joining us here, and I'm so excited to have them here alongside me to speak today. So Merydth is the Senior Gender Advisor from World Vision, and Juanita is a public health practitioner and occupational therapist to be. So the 3 of us will make some brief remarks, and then we will have a Q&A session at the end. But thank you both so much for being here with us today. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Merydth. Merydth, over to you.
Thanks, Alli. I'm going to go to my first slide. So the World Vision is Canada's largest not-for-profit in terms of private cash donations. There's lots of ways to slice this. What this means is that we get the largest amount of revenue from everyday Canadians. In addition, we're also Canada's largest international NGO in terms of operating revenue. So that's another area where World Vision is actually quite a large organization. We have over 400 permanent staff. There are certainly other organizations that have more staff than we do. And we have whittled down a little bit over the course of the last couple of years. So we're down around 400. That staff is largely made up of 2/3 female and 1/3 male. But like lots of organizations, when you go up the chain, our executive team is currently about 35% female and 65% male. A couple of years ago, and appreciating that the executive team is a small number of people, that was closer to 50%. So some people have left and some people have joined, and that's where we're sitting at the moment. The board is the same way, actually. The board is 1/3 female, 2/3 male. It's a little bit closer to about 40-60%, but it is still something that we're trying to work on. We have had 50-50 in the last few years, but at the current moment, that's where we're sitting. So I think it's I always feel it's interesting to look at sort of who's sitting where within organizations. And it's certainly something that is on the minds of our senior management as it moves forward in terms of hiring new people. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about a few different policies. There's a lot on this slide, and we'll go through it quickly, but systematically. So the first thing that I'm going to point out is that we've had a diversity and inclusion policy for several years, but currently it was most recently updated, rather, in 2018. So it does get updated relatively frequently. And it probably is due for another update because the Diversity and Inclusion Committee has just been renamed Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Committee. So that's just been renamed, and the purpose of the policy itself and the committee are to proactively pursue and promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, to eliminate barriers to advancement and to foster a culture of mutual respect where people feel safe. And we do have a very diverse workforce, and this is an important committee, but it was also felt, and we'll get to the gender equality policy, that we needed a specific policy around gender equality. I'll get to that in a moment, and I'll just touch on some other ones that predate the gender equality policy. So there's the Workplace Violence and Harassment and Prevention, Prevention Policy was last updated in 2019. It's an older policy as well, but it gets updated every once in a while. And it's focused on actions within the workplace, so between colleagues in Canada and between colleagues overseas. An important policy that was developed and passed in 2019 is the Child and Adult Safeguarding Policy, and it expands on our child protection standards, and was something that came into being acknowledging some of the abuses that had taken place across the sector in the last few years. And so this is specifically protecting children and adult beneficiaries. And there's a number of elements to this policy, but it's particularly important that we have it. And this is something that gets updated or gets reviewed, annually, and it's something that staff have to sign off on annually. The World Vision's gender equality policy was worked on for the last couple of years, and it was just came into force earlier this year in January, I think. And it is an important policy. It provides basically an overarching framework for the organization. It's specific to World Vision Canada, so it addresses some of the very specific needs that we have here in Canada. It addresses both HR elements within Canada and also programming elements, which is a little bit difficult to put together into one policy, but we did do that. And it's important because it also provides everybody within the organization consistent messaging. The last policy that I want to point out, I should say as well that the gender equality policy is being made available, I think, to everyone. At the end, I think we'll circle back to that. But in any event, that is available if people are interested. The last policy that I'll point out is at a World Vision International level, and it's a gender equality and social inclusion management policy. It's currently in draft form, and that is something very similar to our domestic gender equality policy. It's doing similar things, but at a global level, and we'll have impacts in field offices and regional offices across the partnership. I think it's important to point out that in order to get these policies together and in order to get them implemented, we have different working groups. So here at World Vision Canada, we've got a gender equality working group, which does a lot of work around helping to develop tools and be a sounding board for ideas. It was one of the groups that edited the gender equality policy. There's also a director's reference group on gender equality, which is an important group that provides a link between senior leadership and staff. At the global level, we have a gender equality leadership team and a diversity and inclusion leadership team, and those groups also work to promote gender equality or diversity and inclusion within the partnership and across the partnership. So that's at a global level. Next slide, please. We've been doing some training, and I wanted to point this out because I think it's a really important element to how we're trying to promote gender equality at World Vision. So the first one is unconscious bias training that was developed or started to be rolled out. I guess it was developed in about 2018, end of 2018. It was started to be rolled out in 2019. And the objective of of the training is to help participants to identify and understand the influence of their unconscious bias on workplace effectiveness. And the second thing is that it also helps people understand specifically confirmation bias and affinity bias and how it impacts hiring decisions, performance management, innovation, and collaboration. It was developed using materials from the Cultural Intelligence Center, Google, Daniel Kahneman, and Jolly Coog. So that is one training that we're doing, and that looks at unconscious bias in a number of different realms, not just gender. It looks also at race and other ways in which we might be biased against people. There's another one that we just started rolling out this year, but it's been a little bit challenged by COVID-19. That is the 50 Ways to Fight Gender Bias. That was developed by Lean in collaboration with gender experts from the Stanford VMware Women's Leadership Innovation Lab and Paradigm. And it's an American, very corporate sort of training. We've adapted it slightly, but not a lot, because when you go through the 50 ways that women can experience bias, it is quite shocking actually how many are also relevant to our sector. So what it does is it pairs, it's a card-based activity with the video series, and you go through the different ways to fight gender bias, and it addresses a number of different biases: likability, performance, attribution, affinity, and maternal bias, as well as intersectionality. So it's a very intimate way to look at this. It's very cheap. It's free. You can download it online. I highly recommend it. You can do this with a group of 6 people. You can do it with groups of 50 people. We have piloted this with small groups, and it was cathartic, I think, for women, and revealing for the men. And I think the men really found it surprising as to how much they got out of it. So you can find that on leanin.org. It has, as I said, it's something that is quite intimate. And so COVID-19 has really impacted our ability to roll this out this year. I've been trying to come up with ways that we might be able to do this without meeting in small groups. It's just meeting online and virtually doesn't give people the sense of safety as being in a small group as it does face to face. So it's on hold for the moment, and we'll see where we're at come fall if we're able to move this forward. Next slide, please. So I wanted to touch also on some of the benefits that we have at World Vision. There's a number of ways, and I think that Juanita will be touching on a number of these with respect to COVID-19, and certainly COVID-19 has impacted on our on what it is that we are offering to staff right now. We do have we've had an ongoing benefit package of telecommuting, flexible hours, extended parental leave, including top-up. We have a breastfeeding room that can be booked online. That's a relatively new room. We didn't have a dedicated room for that. It was as nice as it is now. There's a generous vacation, personal and sick days that can also be used for family members. And I think that is particularly important. I've worked at places where you can't use your leave for vacation for family members. So when your child is sick or another family member is sick, you often, women in particular, need more flexibility, but not just women, any parent. So this is really important. There's extended leave, so you could take, for example, a sabbatical or a research term or something like that, where you take time off from work, and that can be worked in. And there's just sort of a general emphasis on the whole person. So there's a number of different ways that, for example, during COVID-19, the organization has attempted to support staff who are, working from home. Everyone's working from home, who've had kids at home. There's still, I mean, in place, there's a lot of flexibility. Sometimes it can depend on your manager. That is something that we're trying to work on. But certainly, you know, if you need to work from 9 to 11 and then your partner's working and then you work again in the evening or something like that, there's been a tremendous amount of flexibility. And in principle, there's a lot of flexibility within the organization and has been. Next slide, please. So I think my last slide here is just focusing on staff engagement. And one of the things that I think is important is this idea that constantly being in a learning mode where you're using data that you're collecting to generate decision making. And so the first thing that we did, and I spoke about this back in November at the annual meeting, was we did in 2018 a gender self-assessment, which was really revealing and really interesting and has helped guide both the policy and some of the approaches that we've taken over the last couple of years. In that, we went into a deeper dive, which is just, you know, looking into the data a lot more thoroughly in small groups with staff, and staff found that, I think, quite revealing. So when you looked at sort of metadata, it said one thing, but when you broke it down by sex, it said something completely different. And so it just revealed different people's experiences. So men's experience and women's experience in various ways. The second thing is an annual survey that the organization does called Our Voice. And it's not just done in Canada, it's done globally. And we have the information from that has always been fed back to the staff. But this past year in 2019, and it will happen again this year, we do a deeper dive based on gender. So we break things out based on men's experiences and women's experiences, and how that is impacting on their work environment. And I said on the previous slide that there's an emphasis on the whole person, and I think that this is one of the ways that they try and get to that. My apologies, it says that my internet connection is unstable. I'm not, but my internet connection is. Anyway, I think that it's, you know, this looks at some of the areas that it looks into is organizational leadership, organizational effectiveness, agility. It also looks at staff engagement, staff care, staff identity. And these are all points to sort of promote kind of, you know, the individual, but also the individual working in a large corporate environment. We have upwards of 40,000 people across the world working for World Vision. So it's a large organization. It can be easy to feel lost in. And the last one I'm just going to point out is just an annual International Women's Day events. We just recently had one. That was the last thing it seemed that we did back in March before we all retreated back to our houses. But we had a great International Women's Day event this year, and it's just opportunities for staff to come together and unpack gender equality and gender equity within the workplace. And there's a real openness to that, I think, in my experience at World Vision, and certainly that idea of being in a continuous learning mode has certainly been exemplified in some of the initiatives of the organization. So I think I had another slide that was for questions, but I think we're going to leave that till the end. Thank you.
That is absolutely fantastic, Merydth. Thank you so much. And I think my presentation will lean in quite nicely after yours, from a very big organization like World Vision to a very small organization relatively. And we can go to the next slide here. So CanWaCH, unlike World Vision, only has just over 20 staff people. When I came on back around 3.5 years ago, I was the 8th person hired, and we've now just gone up over 20 people. So we've seen a lot of growth within the recent past when you look at it as a percentage. So while we're not large, we have still seen percentage-wise quite a bit of growth. And we're relatively new as well. So we just had our 5th birthday back in May in terms of when we had incorporated. And interestingly, from our inception, we have been a fully virtual organization since the get-go. So this means that we have had some lead time compared to others, particularly in responding to COVID-19, in having structures and setup to enable a solid working environment and workplace culture on virtual spaces. However, the caveat is that none of this is normal, and even within our teams, we have seen changes and accommodations that have been required. And I think this really lends to also what Merydth was talking about in terms of continuous learning and the approach to gender equality and the approach to GE as a lens through which to look at HR policies and practices is a never-ending journey. And you'll likely never get to perfect, but it's the journey along the way and the dedication to always trying to make improvements. That is in and of itself an important facet of the work. In terms of our organization, we're also female-led and driven. So of our just over 20 staff right now, we only have one person who would identify as male. And of our board, we also have over 50% of our board who is female as well. But that does not mean that we are exempt from continuous inquiry and learning. And that becomes particularly important when we look at facets of intersectionality as well in the realm of equality. I also wanted to note that one thing that we continually hold as a tension point within our work and how we operate is that we as individuals at CanWaCH and we as we operate as an organization are still working within and responding to patriarchal systems and patriarchal norms that can be restrictive within how even we conceive of our work, how we undertake our own policies and procedures, but then also just the need to think through what is within our realm of possibilities and what is within our realm of control as an organization and as individuals. And then what is the longer term journey and struggle for greater gender equality within Canada as well. So it's again, going back to that notion of we need to be people focused, people centered, but also recognizing that it is the journey that counts and that dedication to the principles of gender equality that matter as much as anything else. So in terms of some things that we have in place, as a relatively new and young organization, we have focused at the beginning on just having really strong HR policies that focus on human rights as a basis. And we did not actually have a GE policy until last year. So our workplace culture and our HR policies really focused on how to support each employee as an individual. And when you're a small team, it is a little bit easier to do this. So to have a small HR team that is able to work with supervisors to make sure that every single individual staff team member is supported in the unique ways that they need support, because we know that some staff require greater degrees of flexibility to be successful, and some staff really require that strong foundation and structure within which to also be successful. So it's balancing out that tension point as well in terms of taking a more equity-based approach to the individual accommodations that are needed so that all staff feel supported and all staff feel like they can operate and thrive within the workplace. I think another thing that I wanted to highlight quickly is the structure versus flexibility piece. So some of the things that we've done around this is having core business hours every day. So we have staff that are spread across Canada from coast to coast and working in different time zones as well. So from 10 a.m. until 3 p.m. with breaks and lunches in there of Eastern Standard Time. Those are our core business hours. And then how you fill your complete workday up around that is up to you, which allows for greater flexibility as a starting point. And then above and beyond that, if staff require additional accommodations or flexibility, then that is available upon request. And within this approach of a really individualized almost approach to gender equality within the workplace, it has led to building a lot of trust and accountability between team members. So it's a mutual accountability and mutual responsibility that exists. But we know that, especially as management, that trust is slow to gain and quick to lose. And so it's a constant commitment and dedication to transparency, accountability, and a commitment to inclusion across all realms of our work. As my last comment, in terms of COVID-19 as well, there's been a couple of things we've done to put in place to support our team in particular. And that's looking at making sure that our team is able to thrive, especially in uncertain contexts. So we've put in place mental health supports through online platforms, and we have accepted and worked with staff on varying levels and degrees of accommodating caregiving responsibilities. We've accepted that in the background you may have a cat, you may have a child, you may have a parent that is popping in and off screen, and that's okay. And then another thing that we're doing over the summer months is condensed work weeks and reading Fridays as well. So it's a chance for the team to step away from their desks and step away from the screen, especially on Fridays, and to catch up on readings, to think through and plan, strategize on key pieces of work, but also to recharge your batteries, because we know that the separation between home and work life, particularly during this time period, is harder. It's harder to achieve, and it's a conscious decision on the part of us as an organization to put this in place for our staff. So we know that as an organization, we've focused a lot on being self-reflective, but that this can be really challenging. It's challenging to look at yourself, and it can be easy to get stuck in the mindset of this is the way that things are and the way that things have been. So yeah, it's a great space to be in terms of having an awesome staff who challenges us and we challenge them, and we have difficult conversations, but it's all with the goal and the intent of moving forward and pushing ourselves bit by bit and step by step to incorporate more gender equality and stronger frameworks into how we do things. So I'm going to leave it there. There's a next slide that has resources, and I won't go through those because they will be shared afterwards as well. So I'm going to leave it there, and in the name of time, I'm just going to turn it over to Juanita.
Hi, everybody. And so, as Erin mentioned, I'm an individual contractor, and I also work in the realm of public health. And if you go to the next slide, yeah, so this is a little bit of my background. I've worked all over the place, and these are the three kind of sectors that I've worked at predominantly in my career span. And today I'm going to be sharing, I think, some of the main challenges I've been hearing across the board from these sectors when it comes to gender equity in terms of like working in the context of COVID-19 and even post-COVID-19, some of the concerns folks are having. As you can see, like most of the sectors I worked in, it's been male dominated, except for my experience in nonprofit. But my experience in nonprofit has been with organizations around food insecurity and also sexual health and reproductive health, and that probably can speak to that dynamic. The other thing I think I wanted to point out is, in my experience in all three of these organizations, they're all heavily underrepresentative of Black, Indigenous, and people of color voices. And so that makes it hard because when I look at their gender equity policies, they've been very male-female oriented, and they really haven't thought broadly around the intersectionalities and the different identities that people come with. And I think that's something that we need to consider as we start moving forward in terms of doing this work in our organizations. So next slide. So what I've kind of put here is, I think what Merydth and Alli have already kind of spoken to, is this is a journey. It's not something that you can do overnight. It's something that's going to take work, but that work you put in is really going to pay out in the end. And what I've kind of shown here is a schema of what the City of Edmonton's inclusion document shows in terms of how the City of Edmonton went about creating a gender inclusive and gender equity and a diversity inclusive strategy for the city, and how they've gone about implementing that into their programming and into their workspaces. And kind of that first main part that took the city a long time was that reflective piece, because really truly you don't really know what those, you don't want to create solutions that aren't actually addressing the underlying root causes of gender inequities in your organizations. And so, you know, for some organizations, it might be the way the hours are structured that are causing people difficulties in doing their work. And for others, it might just be, you know, not being able to connect to colleagues and things. And so really, I wanted to emphasize that, you know, that first piece of reflection and putting that time and effort into there is really going to make this process easier down the road. And the document is linked in the slides. And so you can definitely take a look if your organization is thinking about starting on this work. It's a good starting place. Next slide. And so breaking down that reflection piece a little bit, in my work, what I've noticed is that a lot of the PD and training that's been given to staff has really been around staff to kind of come to terms with their own unconscious biases and to really do that individual reflection. And what I'm seeing is the organizations to do that piece coupled with, okay, now let's look at, you know, intersectionality of the organization. How does this apply to the organization? They're having more success in their gender equity policies, but also having, you know, more productive and happy employees. And so what I put on the slide here, the social identity wheel, it's one of many activities that I've seen organizations use to really help elicit that self-reflection, but also then that organization reflection. And I think, you know, in the context of COVID-19 and working from home, it might be good to, you know, again, pull out these kind of activities, but then do it in like, how has it been working from home in this kind of day and age, right? One parent I spoke to, and this sticks in my mind around, you know, her struggles at work, she said to me, you know, everyone's working from home, but for her, she's not working from home. Rather, she's at home during a pandemic with her family trying to work. And I think that reflection was really important because it really suggests that, you know, her ability to be productive in that 9 to 5 workday, it's no longer reality, right? And so I think it's important to reflect on our current work structures and how they may be hindering and facilitating participation of everybody, right? Because, you know, now we're not in workplaces, we're at home, our families are coming in and out of the spaces, and everybody's situation is different, right? And what I'm hearing from folks is that the gender equity policies that are in place so far have not really, they haven't been updated to reflect the current work environment. And, you know, post-COVID is going to be different. And I think 4 months in, we can kind of already see that this pandemic is going to be with us for a little bit longer. And so I think now is a good time to start having these conversations around gender equity and updating it so that it is inclusive of what people are going through right now. The other part, step 1B, kind of here is this idea that once you've done that reflection and you thought about, you know, what are those gaps or where your organization can do better, now it's time to really engage with those folks who are experiencing those inequalities. And one thing I've heard across the board from individuals who are facing inequalities in the workforce is that usually it comes out in a survey or it comes out in a group meeting, but really having multi-modalities to be able to give feedback is important. Because it's just more inclusive for everybody. You know, some folks don't feel comfortable talking in a Zoom meeting, others would want an anonymous survey. And so it's just something to be mindful that when you start engaging with those communities in your workplace to be inclusive and to use different strategies and modalities so that you can hear everybody's voice. Next slide. Yeah, so what I've done here in the next couple slides is really talk about the main kind of concerns around gender inequalities and just inequality in general as it relates to COVID-19 and what people are experiencing, and then some solutions to those. And I think some of these you've heard from Merydth and Alli, and I think that just speaks to the fact that some of these are really, really vital in helping people to adapt to what's currently happening and to be able to be productive and to be happy in the work that they're doing. So the first one here around meetings, I think what I've heard is we're seeing this increase of people booking meetings without notice, people just sending you links. I've felt that as well. And I think what I'm hearing is, you know, it's not we can't expect that people are sitting in their computer for 8 hours every day, right? And so, having a minimum advance notice, I heard one organization, they do that. You can't book meetings unless it's 3 hours in advance, and that's the minimum. No meeting Tuesdays is another one. And I've actually heard no meeting days has been really, really vital, especially for supporting folks who are neuroatypical. It's really helped them in terms of not getting Zoom fatigue or getting burnt out. It's also been helpful for individuals who are parents. Then they know they've blocked off a time of day where they're not going to have meetings, and they can do their readings and support their children through homeschooling and that as well. Video etiquette, I think, as Alli mentioned, it's become more common in accepting like children are going to be making cameos through your Zoom meetings or your pets or whatever. What I'm hearing from folks though is that some of them feel that those people walking in and out is perceived as almost unprofessional, and that they're worried that that might hinder their ability to advance in the workplace. And so I think some of the suggestions I've given to folks is to really consider, do you need to have your video function on in all the meetings? I know one organization I work with, they have daily meetings where it's a drop-in type of event, and they don't expect you to have your camera on. And that's been helpful for parents, because then they can get their kids ready or get them having breakfast, and the whole company doesn't have to see them, doing that part of their day. And that's been one less thing they have to worry about. And so it's just something to think about, that even though we are being more acceptive of this, that the people that we're trying to accept might not see that as, they might see it as like, oh my God, like it's not professional, and they might cause them more stress, right? And the last piece around project-based work is, I'm finding that has been the most helpful way for individuals to be able to get a sense of work-life balance in their day. And really what's helped is when they have clearly communicated end deliverables from their bosses, and then, the bosses have given these individuals the time and space to budget their own time and negotiate their own time. The other thing that I've heard that some policies that have helped is, instead of focusing on how many hours of work today, to just focus on the total number of hours bi-weekly. And that's been helpful because, especially for parents, some days they're able to work 8 hours a day, and then some days their child gets sick or something happens and they're only able to work 2 hours. And that way they're not stressing out about their hours. And that's helped them to do better quality work and to feel like they can still progress in their job. Next slide. Yeah, and to build off that, I think inflexible work hours obviously feeds into work-life balance. I think what something to consider is, does your organization need an 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. or 9 to 5 structure? The truth of the matter is, now people working from home, it's not that they're just working from home, they're wearing a lot of these other roles and hats at the same time. They're working from home, raising kids, being partners, looking after their home, and they're having to do that all simultaneously, and it's causing burnout, right? And so if your organization decides, to do compressed work weeks or something like that, it can help people to strike that balance, but also to get moving on their tasks. Flex hours is an interesting one. I've seen a lot of organizations start putting that in so their employees can work early hours in the morning or later in the evening. And then, it starts with having a culture of being accepting of different work schedules. I've heard that when organizations are accepting of that, people feel like they have the ability to then basically go and work and schedule their own days. And they feel like they're not rushing to get work done. I had one colleague a couple days ago, their mom had to be tested for COVID, and it just happened out of the blue. And so without flexible work hours, she wouldn't have felt like she would have been able to do that. But then she was able to flex her hours and work later on in the evening. And so having stuff like that has been really, I think, vital in helping people, be able to take care of themselves and the others around them. Next slide. And these are just two things that I thought I would throw in there. I worked in one organization where they had really flexible hours. You could work any time of the day, and people were working all over the country. And then what we found is then folks were sending emails at 3 a.m. and that was really disruptive to parents and others who needed their sleep. And so they put in a policy of 8 to 4 Mountain Standard Time email policy. And then they just trained all the employees on how to use schedule send so that, if you're typing an email at 3 a.m., it doesn't get sent to 8 a.m. And something that was so simple and just allowing people to have that flexible work hours, but also not disrupting people who wanted their sleep. The other thing about email signatures, I saw one organization do this where they just, put a little disclaimer that during this time of disruption, their hours are not your hours. And what they found is that it was really received well, and it allowed people that freedom and flexibility to not feel like they had to respond right away. And that really helped with internal communication and just helping folks, take that time, respond, and feel like their organization was adaptive and flexible and willing to work with their schedule. Next slide. This is another, I think, interesting one that I've heard from a lot of folks, is particularly for women, that remote work can make them feel almost invisible, because with remote work, there's less opportunities for advancement. There's less opportunities to run into managers. They're feeling like they are having less contact with senior staff, so that senior leadership isn't seeing the work that they're doing. And they're starting to feel like that post-pandemic, this might impact their abilities of chance of advancement in their organizations. And so, what I've seen some organizations do is, having one-to-one weekly or bi-weekly meetings where senior staff are engaging with their employees. And that's helpful in giving employees, especially women, a chance to build rapport, bring up concerns, share what they've been doing. The other thing I've seen is organizations that now have like weekly group meetings where they rotate which staff gets a chance to lead those meetings. And also others that have had these policies around professional development. Now with everything kind of being virtual, I have one organization where every 2 weeks you get 7 hours of PD time that you can take, and that's been helpful. And then this last bit too is what I'm hearing is, especially for folks who have disabilities or are a little, or just feeling like, they've moved to a new place or they moved back home, that they're feeling disconnected from their staff because they're in different locations. And so I've heard one organization, they just have a standing meeting every day at 9 a.m. where people can drop in and chat. I've also seen some organizations start to use platforms like Slack, and they have just like a water cooler chat channel where people can just talk about things, share recipes, that kind of thing. Another cool technique I've seen is people just opening up Zoom meetings 10 minutes prior so that people can connect and talk and really, feel like they're still part of the organization. I think the one thing I wanted to emphasize is that what I'm hearing from folks is it's difficult to observe and correct inequitable practices when employees are working remotely. And so I think, ensuring that we're creating spaces for everyone to talk and have opportunities to bring up when things happen is really important, because it's not the same as working in person. I'm hearing it's just harder. People don't usually have a platform, or they don't know where to go, right? So I think even having that at a staff meeting, like if something comes, here's a form to fill out, or here's who you talk to, will help you to know what's happening in the organization. Next slide. Yeah, and then the last bit here is around measuring success. I think pre-COVID, a lot of us were measuring our success in terms of number of people coming out to events, number of engagements made, and the truth is, like, those connections and things, it's not possible now, just given the way people's schedules are changing and working. And so what I've seen one organization do is, instead they're looking at the quality of engagement, the quality of relationships, instead of looking at number of, and that's helped their employees to then not focus on just, outreach and doing all this work, but to really spend that time building connections. And it's changed and shifted the workload in a way that's had positive results. The other thing I'm hearing from folks is really considering like how organizations are recognizing the work employees are doing, because they said, post like the pandemic happened and then everyone was working from home, and now 4 months in, like, we've kind of lost how we're recognizing folks or how we're, telling them it's a good job. And so I put some things here that I've seen, weekly email updates. I've seen a lot of organizations go into this, like doing weekly updates around what everyone's doing, or having an all staff distribution list where people can, share what they're doing to everybody all at once, or shout outs at group meetings. But it's really important to make sure that we're recognizing employees and their success, especially because, as it comes back to what that one mom was telling me, a lot of folks are working, at home during a pandemic where they're trying to balance and juggle so many things all at once. And so being recognized means a lot more for them this time. It helps them to feel like they're doing a good job, and gives them somehow like the motivation and I think encouragement to be able to keep going. Next slide. And yeah, so the key takeaway, I think, from what I've heard and everywhere I've worked, is really people want to know that organizations are being adaptive and flexible. And so for you all, it's considering how are you communicating that to your organization? Is it through a policy? Is it through workplace culture? and whatever you choose, it really starts with that leadership, and it really starts with being proactive and unearthing these inequalities present. They are there, and I think that, when the pandemic started, that wasn't a priority. For most of us, it was just getting our organizations adapted to online technology and being able to do our work. But now, as the months have kind of gone on, it's time for us to start looking at their policies and revamping them to reflect the current realities of working from home and post-pandemic, what the workplace is going to look like. And I have some resources at the end. Oh, next slide. Yeah, I have some resources. I won't go through these, but these are some cool things that you can do with your organization, or if you're interested in more information, that might support, that first step around reflecting in terms of getting a gender equity policy in place. And yeah, that's all I had to say.
Amazing. No, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. And I loved your points around communication in the virtual workplace, and what is observable behavior in a virtual workplace as well, and how can you tell if your team is doing well or not doing well. And so how do you create that open, transparent dialogue or spaces for that to happen? And then also the question around like the quality of work, how we judge and assess productivity, and how we acknowledge work as well, especially when virtual, becomes really important, and is constantly something that I know we're thinking about at CanWaCH, and I know that other teams, as they've switched to working virtually, that's something that they are taking into consideration as well. Now, I know that these were amazing presentations, and we were hoping to have a longer Q&A session, but I think that all the information here leads into other conversations that we can have in the future as well. So again, to reiterate that this is one stop along the way of the journey that we are taking together. Any questions that you do have right now, please put them into the Q&A box at the bottom. I'm not seeing anyone who has raised their hand. If there is anyone right now, please do so. Otherwise, we have time to answer one question. And there is one question that did come in for Merydth. And any questions that do come in at this point, we will take them and we can get some responses and circle them back to everyone after the webinar. And just to reiterate that, that the slides will be shared, a recording of this video will be shared, and all the resources will be shared as well for everyone's knowledge. So with that, we'll just take this one question that came in for Merydth. And the question was, can you talk more about the gender self-assessment and how World Vision integrates a gender lens that is not only looking at gender as a binary?
Thanks for the question. I'm not sure if this is a two-part question. So is one part about the gender self-assessment and one part about integrating a gender lens sort of writ large? I'll try and integrate them together as best as I can. So we did the gender self-assessment. We used the interaction tool, and then we modified it quite a bit. World Vision itself actually uses that tool and has sort of a global gender self-assessment that it uses. We identified particular questions for different divisions, and then we collated all of the responses. We were specifically looking at sort of gender equality and gender mainstreaming in generally across the organization, and then we were looking specifically at some of the HR issues and sort of corporate culture or organizational culture, and that helped to inform sort of priorities for the gender policy and priorities in terms of training and programming and other things that World Vision is doing there. In terms of integrating a gender lens that's not only looking at gender as binary, I think that that's a really good point. And I think that it's certainly World Vision follows, in terms of hiring practice, follows, anyone is welcome. So it follows Canadian, law that way, and I think that it's the the issue of gender as a non-binary is something that I think is a process for a number of different organizations. And I think that World Vision would fall into that also, in terms of looking at how different people understand that. And so I think that that's something currently that we are working on and we're currently looking at. In addition, in terms of our programming, gender is not a consideration. In terms of gender binary is not a consideration. So it's sort of like, you don't have to identify as a boy or identify as a girl or a man or a woman. Everyone is served by the programs regardless of their gender identity. So I think that's an important consideration. And that's in our programming. So in terms of staffing and in terms of programming, I think it's quite an open environment. But I think it's a question across the sector. And in fact, it's something that the Gender Equality Working Group has been looking at, is around greater inclusion of LGBTQ plus in our language and our programming. How are we addressing that? So that's actually something that the working group that from where this particular webinar comes from has been actually actively starting to look at. And I think it's something that we need to be more actively looking at across our sector. So thank you for the question. I don't know if that answered the question, but.
I think that was great, Merydth. And yeah, it's definitely a key consideration within the Gender Equality Working Group and the work that you guys are doing on that. So I think that's really cool. So there will be space for us to answer other questions that have come in. So I would encourage you all, if you have other questions, to please email Erin Jex at CanWaCH, and we can make sure that we get responses for all of you. But I would like to thank both Merydth and Juanita for being here today, for sharing their expertise and knowledge, and being a very open about processes, which can be a little daunting at times, but also sharing is the first step in order to be able to think through other things that are available to us and other ways of doing things. So thank you both for sharing your knowledge and expertise. And thanks to each of you for being here today with us. It's been a pleasure to have you on board. Once again, we will be sharing all of this with you, the recording and the webinars as well. And in terms of up next week, we have a webinar that's focused on research and gender equity during a pandemic that we will be co-hosting with the YWCA Canada. And in the follow-up email that we'll be sending you, there's a registration link for you to sign up for that as well. So as a final word, thank you each and every one of you for being here today. Thank you to Merydth and to Juanita, and for my CanWaCH colleagues for running the background of this. And take care, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Bye for now. Thank you.